Hello everybody, I'm just going to attempt to start sharing my screen, so just bear with me. Hopefully it will all work beautifully.
It's coming up now, saying Clive Holmwood is
Great, if I
started
from the
screen sharing. There we go, lovely.
Great,
Okay.
okay. Can everyone see the whole screen there, yeah?
Yes, we can.
Great, okay, thanks Sarah. Okay, yeah, so good evening everybody. As Sarah said, we're very old friends. I won't say exactly how long ago it was. We were at university together, but it's been a while. We studied drama together, and yeah, and Sarah very kindly invited me to come along this evening to talk to you all. Yeah, just to correct one thing, Sarah, I am a drama therapist, but I'm not a play therapist, just to clarify. Although I am a play, that's all right. I'm a play practitioner and a neurodramatic play practitioner, but I'm not actually a play therapist. Although a lot of what I do, there's a lot of crossover between drama therapy and play therapy in particular. Yeah, I am Associate Professor, Discipline Therapeutic Arts at Derby. We've got an undergraduate degree in arts, health and well-being, and then we've got 4 postgraduate degrees in drama, dance, music and art therapy, and the postgraduate trainings are the ones that qualify you as therapists. We're thinking about play therapy as a postgraduate program, but we haven't quite got that off the ground just yet. So yeah, that's the background. And in particular, our undergraduate degree, which has been going for almost 30 years now, has used a lot of creative approaches within the program. So some of that, the stuff I'll be sharing with you over the next few minutes, will be based on that practice that's gone on for quite some time now, and is also based on a book that we produced a couple of years ago, which I'll talk to you a little bit about towards the end. Okay, I've got several key things that I want to introduce people to this evening. I guess 3 or 4 key areas. And what I'd like to do is connect them, this notion that education, playfulness and creativity is relational. So we're going to be looking at education. I'm going to be introducing some ideas about Winnicott, liminal space and threshold concepts, and how we might use some of these, and then a brief case study towards the end. Hopefully that won't overload you too much, but I'm going to try and keep it as simple as I possibly can. Let's start off with what is education. We could spend the rest of our lives discussing this one, couldn't you? But from an arts perspective, just a couple of interesting comments. Herbert Reed described it as the preparation of the artist. And what he meant there was that it wasn't actually, creating you to be a painter or a dancer, but that there should be a flexibility and an openness to this notion of kind of merging ideas. So for him, that was really important. Students to act and to judge in the absence of rules, to rely on feel, to pay attention to nuance, and to act and appraise the consequences of one's choices, and to review and make other choices. And this is particularly relevant for those who've got backgrounds in drama and theatre and educational theatre, because when we step into somebody else's shoes, we have to try and think about it from their perspective. So all of these arts-based ideas are really useful. One of the ideas that we also thought about was this notion of the life-wide curriculum. And I know many of the students, Sarah, are training in training to work in FE and HE. And this notion of education isn't something you do at a particular time in your life and then forget about it, but it covers the whole of our lives. It's not fixed, it's life-wide. And also thinking about context. People are learning and being educated to work in complex contexts within the world. it's specific for each student as well. There is no one way that fits all for all students. Every student is unique. Um, we reflect we reflect through all of our senses, not just the way that we think, but touch and feel. Um, Students take responsibility for developing their own capabilities, qualities, and confidence. Um, and we use a lot on our programs this notion of embodied artistic approaches. And when we talk about embodied, what we mean is this notion of using the whole self, of feeling and understanding through self, which is something I'm particularly interested in. Had I got time, I would go on to talk about a colleague of ours from another university, Professor Norma Jackson, who talks about learning ecologies. I'm not going to go into that here because we really don't have the time, but this notion of play being relational, context, resources, space, relationships, and process are some of the. So yeah, let's move on to creativity. Again, we could spend all night, but I particularly like this idea from Kaufman, 2008. Creativity is the interaction among aptitude, process, and environment by which an individual or group produce a perceptible product that is both novel and useful as defined within a social context. And I think what's really important about this is what he's talking about here is relational, that either the individual is relating to the creative product that they're producing, or they are relating to the other people that they're working with in relation to the project or product that they're creating. So it's this notion, and I guess this is part of my background as a therapist, this notion of things being relational, connection between things, and that creativity itself is relational. It's external to self and requires relationships to be formed. So creativity is about relationships, and people might find that a little bit of a different way of thinking about it. So then this notion of creativity is also the way that we might communicate is through playfulness. And I would argue that playfulness is central to being creative and learning, particularly so for younger children, but also for older children and also for adults. So when we're playing, it's outside of the box thinking, it's improvising, which is kind of where I want to very briefly mention one of the theorists around. I'm trying not to get heavy into theory, but I think the work of Donald Winnicott is particularly useful. He was a child psychotherapist and psychiatrist, and he came up with this notion of what we call potential space. What can happen in the space? His other particular thing was this notion of transitional objects. And this relates to this notion of, as very young babies and children will often orientate themselves to the world around them by finding and connecting with objects. When they're born, they don't actually know which bits is themselves and which is something else. Grabbing hold of a favorite piece of material or a dummy even, the object is symbolic at first. It then moves towards a playfulness and eventually becomes a tool. So the infant's capacity to create, think up and devise is developed. So I just kind of wanted to use this notion of Winnicott as a way of thinking about educational and creative play, this notion of going from something that's at one end very symbolic through a playful stage to it becoming a tool. So something that starts off as an idea and then is developed into a concrete thinking when you do your final assessment for a piece of work. So just this notion of the cycle of creativity as being practice and explorative. So yeah, that's Winnicott in 2 seconds. One of the other areas that I want to bring to your attention is this notion of liminality. And the book we wrote a couple of years ago, we actually divided it into sections which based on liminality. And this is based on the anthropologist Arnold van Gennep, who observed rituals across landmarks during human life. So birth, marriage, death, they're all rituals. But for each one, he described what he calls the rites of passage. And in these rites of passage, you have the preliminal, which is a separation, so moving out of something. You have the liminal, where you're not one thing or another. And then you're into the third state, which is incorporation, where you become part of something else. So it's this notion of shifting, and my own doctoral research was looking at that liminal space within a drama and education context. So this notion of moving from one place to another, which is kind of what we do in education, quite literally. So for example, a student might be coming from secondary into further, going from further into higher education. So that in itself is a kind of liminal phase. So it's this notion of navigating this teaching experience. And this is something we sometimes forget, that it's a huge shift for students coming from one place to another. And that in one sense, they're in a liminal phase when they move to a new way of educating, a new way of learning things. And then obviously we have the incorporation when the final assessments are completing and they leave to go on to either further or higher educational work. So I just kind of want to introduce that sort of anthropological frame. Now my final and third main theoretical idea, and I know I'm throwing a lot at you, so I do apologize. But this, I think, is intrinsic with creativity and playfulness. This is something developed not that long ago by Meir and Land, 2003. And this is what we call the threshold concept, or it's also described as troublesome knowledge. So when you are first introduced to a new idea, as maybe some of you at this moment as I'm speaking to you might be being introduced to a new idea, what you're going to do is get very anxious. I don't understand. It's difficult. That's what we call troublesome knowledge. I haven't got my head around this. What does it mean? However, as you begin to understand, as you begin to take it on board, something begins to happen. There's this transformative state. It kind of changes the way that you think about something and kind of makes it irreversible. Oh, now I've got that piece of knowledge or that idea in my head. I can't forget it. You can't turn back to old ideas because you've integrated it into the way that you are. So just the bottom of this slide here, threshold concepts represent more than just the acquisition of new ideas or knowledge. They are conceptual shifts in thinking and the understanding of the individual learner. And that threshold concept is going to be troublesome. It's going to cause difficulties. It's going to cause challenges. And you might find it quite intimidating or frustrating if you don't get it. But that is part of the educational process. So a typical example, and we have this happen particularly on our postgraduate programs, where the student will, particularly when I'm working with drama therapy trainees, I'm working with this client in this way. Could you tell me what the answer is for, to do this piece of work? How do I do it? And they say, well, but you haven't told me. Oh, so the lecturer, they must know the answer, but they just don't want to tell us. However, from the lecturer's point of view, is there is not necessarily an answer. There's not necessarily a right or a wrong. And this can be disinhibiting to arts and arts therapy students, particularly in the early phases of their training or their education, where they want an answer to be given, but the lecturer is just being awkward and won't give them the answer. However, coming back to threshold knowledge, once they step through this notion of threshold knowledge, they learn that it's okay to know, okay to not know, and to live with the notion of, I don't fully get that, I don't fully understand that. This is troublesome knowledge, and this is that liminal space where the student has to work harder. And these ideas are also very troubling in a binary world where we expect an answer. And I'd forgotten I'd left don't mention Brexit, but I won't mention it. No, the answer has to be this, or it has to be that. Well, what if it's neither? And that's what we call troublesome knowledge, and that's where that liminal space occurs, and particularly within creative approaches to education as well. Because as it says here, threshold concepts can be troubling, they can trouble students. The key to this is the strength of the student-tutor relationship to assist the student to cross that liminal learning threshold. So that's particularly important, that it's okay to be uncertain and it's okay to not know. That suggests that you're learning. That suggests you're in that liminal troublesome space. Some of the research, which I haven't got time to talk about tonight, was thinking about assessments and student assessments, but my limited research into this field has shown that the greater the strength of the relationship between the student and the teacher, the greater the ability is for the student to manage their assessments and their assessment outcomes. So again, it's coming back to this notion of it being relational. In the same way that the strength between a therapist and a client is central to therapeutic relationships. In a similar way, the strength between the teacher and the student needs to be nurtured within an educational context. And I know for many, many teachers working with classrooms of 30 students, that is incredibly challenging and very difficult, particularly if teachers are working with a range of students with a range of different needs. So I'm talking about an ideal here, in the ideal world, which of course we don't always manage to get to. So the arts and liminality and threshold concepts. Liminal teaching and threshold concepts are integral to arts and arts therapist teaching and training. The arts are not physical, they're not tangible necessarily, and it's that amorphousness, that not being able to nail it down, that can be a struggle and can be a challenge. For example, when we're performing, when we're creating a piece of artwork, creating a dance, we don't necessarily know exactly what we're doing it as we're creating it. And again, the analogy in the arts therapies, when the client relationship is central, we do not always know what someone else is thinking, or what they imagine, or what the characters might mean. And that's okay. We can't be inside other people's heads. And to use that famous quote, no one really knows what the woman in the picture is thinking. No one knows for sure. We've spent the last several hundred years trying to decide what that's about, but none of us will ever know. So again, it's about that not knowing and sitting comfortably with that. Okay, so I'm now going to use a case study that kind of incorporates lots of these ideas. And this is a case study that is coming out in a book that I've co-edited on play, therapeutic play and play therapy. And I'm kind of just going to point out some of these ideas. Neurodramatic play is a particular way of working developed by well-known drama therapist Sue Jennings. So it's about the creative thinking about the way that the mind and the brain is impacted on creativity and touch and embodied work. So this piece of work, very briefly, I worked with a small group of 8 to 11-year-olds over 9 weeks in a middle school. They were all picked because they had low self-esteem. Or issues in relationship to that. As I say, this isn't therapy work, but obviously, hopefully, was therapeutic. And we decided to use this notion of a hero's journey, going on a journey, based on Joseph Campbell's notion of a hero with 1,000 faces, which is quite a well-known thing. And also, he heavily influenced the writers and producers of Star Wars as his students. Now, within our story, these children were given the full rein to develop a story, create props over 8 weeks, and then go on the journey in the last session. But the really important thing to point out here is we didn't try it out in advance. We didn't rehearse it for weeks. We did it once and once only in the very last week. So what were the themes that came from this work? We had leadership, friendship, camaraderie, creating a map, making props, improvisation, and creativity. And the work went fantastically well. Kind of what I want to introduce you to now is somebody that came with us on this journey, and this is Sam. Sam is what we might call our attachment friend. Sam came out of my bag every week. It's actually the bag that I use sometimes with therapy work. And Sam squeaks. In fact, I can bring him out my bag afterwards if you want to hear him squeak. Maybe we could do that. Sam came with us over the whole of the 8 or 9 week journey, and Sam was passed around the group. The children held him, the children touched him, the children, I say him, it's him stroke her actually, because Sam has no sex. So that was quite an important thing. So Sam could be male or female or neither, depending on how children wanted to respond. So this notion of touch and feel and embodiment is important. However, this is where it gets really exciting. About 3 or 4 weeks after our piece of work finished, I went back to the school to meet again with the children. Oh, sorry. I've moved my slides. There we go. And what I did is, and as with most 8 to 11-year-olds, you didn't get a lot of response. It was the middle of January. We actually ended up in the staff room. And I said, so what's it like then? You know, let's talk about what we did. Silence. Complete and utter silence. I'm there thinking, I've got this research project I need to do. How am I going to do it? And then I had a sudden thought, I'll bring Sam out the bag. Sam came out the bag, and within probably 30 seconds, Sam was back in the room, and there was talking, there was excitement. Everyone remembered Sam. They might not have much embodied memory of the experience, but the moment Sam was introduced, they started sharing their thoughts and sharing their ideas. And that was a revolutionary thing for me and brought back this notion to me. Education and creativity and play are relational. It's about the relational experiences that people have. And then I won't read these out because I've had them on screen, but you can see them yourself. These are the comments that children came out with after Sam was reintroduced. And I just want to quote the very last one, question 4. I will not be as quiet as I was. I will be brave and not scared. And I learned so much from them about how to conduct my research, but also about the importance of that notion of relationships. So finally, and I have nearly finished, this notion of practicalities. So the idea is within creative classrooms and creativity to reduce physical material and content, which is what I've done very badly tonight because I've thrown so much at you. Students in FE and HE, more time for individual study, less emphasis on taught lectures and seeing the tutor as expert, put the tutor in the rear seat, let the students take some of the classes, let the student, and this is what we do often within our undergraduate and postgraduate work. Experiential workshops, the notion of feeling and touch and creativity. Using people and bodies to represent numbers in a maths lesson, actually, going back to what Sarah said earlier. Introduce reflective coaching and or supervision groups. Broader and innovative module assessments, and all of our assessments, most of our programs have a practical as well as an academic written aspect to it. Good working relationships, personal tutorships being an emphasis. Create space for uncertainty and ambiguity, which is counterintuitive. We don't want to create spaces where people aren't sure what's happening, but actually that's where the best places happen. And the notion of the flipped classroom, which is I don't really have time to go into. So just to finish off then, I quite like this from Schoen Swamp. These so-called minor professions contrast with the learned professions such as medicine and law, in which technical rationalist procedures might be more rigidly followed. Sean characterized the learning professions as inhabiting the high ground, while those in the minor professions work in the swampy lowlands of practice, where real problems are encountered. In the swamp, however, practitioners develop their knowledge through encountering and solving unexpected complex problems. They learn to think on their feet and be creative in response to the contingency of real practice. Thus, these workers develop through their artistry a stock of skills, knowledge, and understanding, the know-how that underpins their professional practice. And I think that says so much about creativity, about the arts, and about using play within educational contexts. Most of this work is in the book here, Learning as a Creative and Development Process in Higher Education, which has been written by former, current members of staff, and also by some former students who also had chapters describing their experience. That's out in paperback now. The case study will be out in this book, which is out at the end of this month, and that's the Routledge International Handbook of Play, Therapeutic Play and Play Therapy, and that covers all of the play in all the broadest contexts, including play therapy. There's some references. I'll leave them on screen for a few seconds so people can digest them if they want to. I guess the one underlined towards the top is the one where most of this stuff has come from, and probably will be most relevant to you all. Well, actually, that's the chapter that I wrote, but it's actually the book. It's the book itself, which is actually towards the bottom of the screen, Taylor J. Holmwood C. That's the actual book itself. I think that wraps me up, Sarah. I've no idea how long I've taken.
Thank you very, very much. If you could stop sharing your screen, that would be marvellous.
I will, when I can work out to do that. Bear with me. Yeah, bear with me just a moment.
I have to say that picture of the person in the swamp struck a chord with me, because it's about how I felt at one point last week. So I think we're all in that swamp a little bit at the moment, on the run up to Christmas and until the next lockdown finishes. So thank you for that. Oh, can we just have a little round of applause, please, for Clive on there? Thank you very, very much. Now we've got some questions in the chat.
Okay.
Dan, we're just going to have, I think we've got time for 2 or 3 questions before we go into Sarah's presentation. Is there any particular one, Dan, that you would like to pick out for Clive to answer?
Yeah, we've got some really great feedback, and we've got one question here is, does structure in education inhibit creativity?
Wow. Does structure in education?
That's a proper essay title, that one, isn't it?
It is.
You've actually got an answer for it, 2 down.
Yeah, I would say that it can, but I'll give you an example from a drama perspective. If I walked into a room and said to a bunch of drama students, create me a play, the first thing, well, what do you mean create me a play? What the play about? What should it be about? If I was to walk into a room and say to a bunch of drama students, okay, let's create a play today, and these do is I give them a framework. And I think that giving students frameworks can be very helpful. However, if you've structured it in such a way that it becomes inhibitive, then yes, it can stop. Because what we're not allowing is enough space for creativity and fluidity. And at the same time, we also want to give space for those liminal spaces for me to say, well, this is what I want you to do. And for students to say, well, I'm not sure how to interpret that exactly. Well, maybe that's not such a bad thing. I want you to go away and interpret it. Sarah, would you want to add anything to that? Because
yeah, well, you know what I'm like with structure. I like to push the boundaries of structure, as all of you looking at me will know. I like to encourage students to explore. Yes, you can give them a basic structure, but I think some of the most interesting work comes out of work where students have their own autonomy. That's what I found in my research, and can create things that they like and enjoy themselves. I really enjoyed that, Clive. I really like the idea of troublesome knowledge. And so I think, to sum it up, what you're saying is it's okay not to know. sometimes, or not to understand.
absolutely.
But that's
Yeah.
quite a scary space for some of our trainee teachers.
Absolutely, it's scary.
Learning
Absolutely.
how to use Zoom and Microsoft Teams, and especially, and the trainees will know who I'm talking to. The people that like control an organisation, being in that space is quite scary for some people.
Absolutely.
And the learning curves that we're going through on the PGCE. So